I want to look this morning at a couple of things that you need to lean into and something you need to lean away from if you're going to be the kind of person that God can use to turn the world upside down. And we're also going to look at what does it mean to turn the world upside down, because as the late Billy Graham used to say, he realized many years into his ministry that he had confused the American dream with the kingdom of God. They are not the same. When I first started, I don't even like using the word ministry, but church work. My husband and I were on staff at a church in the Chicago area, and the last 5 years we were there, I was given the wonderful leadership role of being a part of a church that experimented for really one of the first times in our country's history of making a space in our church for the next generation. It was kind of an attempt to look at postmodern, post-Christian culture and see how we could get that generation. So it was mostly college kids and post-college kids. And we met in the gymnasium, and over the course of 5 years, we tripled that ministry. But my husband used to love to remind me with this age group, I only needed to preach on 3 things to triple our attendance: sex and dating, end times, and will there be sex and dating in the end times? So I just want to go on record right now to tell you I'm not talking about any of those 3 things. I'm sorry. Not that they're not very interesting, and I'm glad to answer questions afterwards about that. But part of our call as Christ followers is to take very seriously the answer to the question, what does it mean to turn the world upside down? Who do I need to be? And what do I need to do? Because doing and being are inexorably linked together. They're part of what makes us human. Sometimes it's really good for us to stop and pull them apart from each other and dwell in each one separately, but inevitably, like a magnet, they get pulled back together again because that is part of what it means to be created in the image of God. When we think about turning the world upside down, our mind can go quickly to things that correlate with the great American dream. Big things, flashy things, things with lots of numbers and success. And it's not to say that God doesn't need deeply devoted Christ followers in those arenas, for sure. But equally as important, because nobody's life will be fully contained in that orb, we also need to know what it means to follow God in humility, in obedience, and faithfulness when our world is very different than that, or when we have both of those worlds in us at the same time. I'll just tell you, it's a lot easier to follow God when my world looks like this, but the question always is, am I really following God, or am I just flying on the wings of success? Because they're very different. When John and I lived in Chicago, and I'm from LA originally, so Chicago was kind of hard for me. Yeah, LA good, Chicago no. I do notice that you don't have any colleges in your ministry in the Chicago area, so I feel very safe saying this. I told some of the group this morning, like, whatever pioneer stopped his wagon in Chicago, I was like, keep going, go. But we lived in a little cul-de-sac, and over the 9 winters that we lived there, we got to know the people in our cul-de-sac pretty well. Most all of them went to church, except the neighbors to our left. They did not go to church. So being the good Christians that we were, we knew our job. We knew that God had planted us in a reason in that cul-de-sac, in that house, to bring them to Christ. And we were pastors on staff at a church nearby, and so as we got to know them, occasionally during those first years, we would invite them to church when my husband was preaching. Now, they were both about 10 years older than we were. They were childless by choice, and they were very devoted school teachers. Let's hear it for school teachers. I told my kids last year that if I ever were to run for president, which I wouldn't do, and gosh, could we talk about that for a while, but we're not going to. If I did, I would run on one platform, that for 1 year, we're going to take celebrity salaries and give them to school teachers. And that same year, we're going to take teachers' salaries and give them to celebrities. And I pretty much guarantee the world would be a different place in about 365 days. So, but I digress. So they're school teachers. They love their work. They're very devoted to it. They don't go to church. So we would invite them, and when I told them that my husband was going to be preaching, they would get this kind of frozen smile on their face, and you could see the wheels turning, and they'd said, "Oh, gosh, we'd love to. Oh, we're going to be grading papers this weekend. It's just not going to work out for us. Maybe another time." So I foolishly took them seriously, and a few months later, I said, "Hey, I'm preaching this weekend, and we'll just take you out to lunch afterwards. Maybe a free meal would help." And that frozen smile a little tighter showed up, and very quickly they squeaked out, "I think we're going to be clipping our fingernails that weekend." It was just painfully clear very, very early on that they were not interested in sermons or big churches or any of the successful things that I would have thought would have been a draw. Now, over the years, she had breast cancer, he had a heart attack. We visited them both in the hospital. We shared meals together. We talked in the front yard on the rare days that the sun actually came out and shared gardening tips. We had a good relationship with them. 2 years before we moved away from Chicago, in our 7th year, Neil, the husband, comes running over to the front yard and says, "Hey, what time do your church services start this weekend?" Like, what? Why would you be asking me that? Because it was hard for me to imagine, most of this was unconscious, it was hard for me to imagine that it wasn't something that I had done that could control them getting to church. Here's what happened. They worked at a school, very devoted to their kids. They had a teacher's aide that was a partner with them in their classes. They treated her like family. They loved her. She was a single mom of 3 kids whose husband left her when her youngest was 2. You know how much money teacher's aides make. She had no car. She would get her kids ready for school early in the morning and then take them to the neighbors who would get them off to school while she took 2 buses to get to work. And she came into work one morning beaming and went to find my neighbors and said, "You're never going to believe what's happened. This church that I don't even go to gave me a free van. And inside the van were little coupons for gas stations and car washes." And she just could not contain her excitement that somebody knew her situation enough that had told somebody else and that there was this ministry at this church. And my neighbors are asking questions, and finally they said, I think that's the church our neighbors work at. That is what propelled our neighbors to go to the church that we were both pastors at. Not our preaching, not the music, not all the ministries we had at the church, except this one ministry. It was called the Cars Ministry, and I want to tell you for just a few minutes how it got started. One Sunday, a couple years before John and I came to be on staff at this church, at the end of the sermon, our senior pastor was standing down off the pulpit, and people were greeting him and talking to him, and there was a man waiting to talk to him who was very, very tall, very skinny, had tobacco stains around his nails, had tattoos and piercings everywhere, smelled like smoke, and told him, "This church changed my life about 1.5 years ago. Never grew up going to church, but my life fell apart. My wife left me, took our kids. I was heavily addicted. I lost my job. I thought about killing myself. And somebody told me I should try coming to this church. And the first Sunday, I came alone. In fact, my life was in such a mess, I came alone, and I had a gun." And Bill's like, "Ushers? Security? Sunday school teachers? Anybody help?" And then he went on to say, after 18 months of listening to sermons and hearing the music, meeting the people, being in small groups, being in recovery program, he had slowly but surely began to open his scared, little wounded, Teflon heart up to the love of God and began to understand who Jesus was and that Jesus really did love him, and the people around him were showing him that love, and he began to piece his life back together slowly but surely. And then he said to our pastor, "I am so filled up with what has happened here, and I want to give back, but I can't preach a sermon, and I don't sing. I'm a mechanic. And at first I thought there's nothing I can do, but I'm so filled up, I got to do something, because that's what grace does in your life, that I have an idea." And then, these are almost his exact words. He said to our pastor, "You know, you have a lot of rich people that go to your church. I can tell by the cars they drive. But you have a lot of poor people that go to your church. And when I'm out in the parking lot and I see people get out of these really bad cars, 8 out of 10 of them are single moms. In fact, some of them are so bad that after the moms take the kids into the doors of the church, I get on my back and go underneath and look at the engine, and Bill's thinking, he's got a gun, he's going under the cars, this is not a good situation. And then he said this, I have an idea. The next time you preach, what if you tell the rich people in the church that when they go to get a new car, they don't need the resale value on their car. Have them donate the car to the church. And we'll take it to auction, and we'll buy 4 good cars for the cost of that one car, and then I'll get some other people like me, and we'll fix them up. And there was a leader who took very seriously that in this man resided the dignity of God and spiritual gifts and grace overflowing. He didn't minimize it or dismiss it because it wasn't a big idea. He had no idea that the year my neighbors came to faith because of that ministry, that our church would give away 200 cars in 1 year to single moms, most of whom didn't know or weren't a part of the church. But people in our church said, hey, I have somebody in my neighborhood who's really going through hard times. They could use it. And I got to tell you, the next time that I preached, I got up there and watched my neighbors as part of the usher team bring the offering plates down. And then 2 years later, when John and I left Chicago and moved back to California, they called us and said, we're going to move to Florida because when you live in Chicago, you just got to get out. Can you help us find a Jesus-centered church in Florida? Because this changed our lives. Eventually, the sermons and the music and the small groups helped them, but that's not what was the front door. There's a talk that I do because the last 12 years of my life I've been involved in corporate consulting, and I do a talk when I talk to businessmen and women of faith of 4 areas that I would have fired Jesus over in leadership. It's actually called If I Had Been Jesus' Leadership Consultant. And one of the things that I talk about is if you're going to start a movement, if you're going to be disruptive, if you're going to turn the world upside down, you use corresponding language. You talk about tsunamis and lightning and seismic shifts. You talk about power that is unmistakable. Jesus, as a leader, you don't talk about salt and light and yeast and seed. Those are really little cute things, but they don't cause movements. Or do they? Because when Jesus was talking about those little things, he wasn't just giving us a cute story. He was telling us, hey, I was at the beginning of the world with my Father and the Spirit, and we created the world to operate according to this system. Let me tell you what the operating system is for the world. There is a disproportionate impact of small things. Small things that I overlook, that I dismiss, that I cannot imagine would have the kind of power to shift and turn the world upside down. But Jesus himself is saying that's how this whole thing works. There's a disproportionate impact of small things because the nature of the universe was created to operate that way. So I want to talk this morning about one thing you need to lean into and one thing you need to avoid to become the kind of people who can be with God as his child and not have to perform to earn his love. And then with that inside can turn around and do things that may be big in the world's eyes or small in the world's eyes, but in God's eyes, all count. The first one is something that you're already used to. I remember when I was in college that everybody would tell me these are the best years of your life. And I'd think, oh no. First of all, that means everything's downhill after this. And I had some good times in college, and I had some really hard times in college. I had an 8 a.m. philosophy class that was actually amazing. Amazing. I couldn't believe it 8 o'clock in the morning because I'm not a morning person, but I love learning about existence and knowledge and values and reason and what could you prove and what couldn't you prove and what is the good life. I had an evening art history class where I got exposed to this unbelievable continuum of the culture and the context into which art was produced and what they were trying to say and everything in between. I got exposed to a vast field of learning on so many ends of the spectrum. It kind of blew me away. Kind of created FOMO that early in my life. And I always tell God, if I'm guilty of that, it's your fault. You made such a remarkable world. But during college, I also found that my best friend was dating my boyfriend. And yeah, I mean, come on, Lynn Clewert, come on. You don't do that. You just don't do that. Are you hearing me right now, everybody? Because if any of you are doing it, I need you to stop. Okay? So, that these are the best years of your life, let's hope not. Let's hope they're just the beginning and that God is doing something to weave in you a step away from whatever inherited faith you may or may not have to figure out what do you believe, to start to understand who God made you to be and to be that person. So the first thing you need to lean into is to be a lifelong learner. A lifelong learner. It really is what Jesus called his disciples to be when he called them. He taught them so many things that were counterintuitive that they were often scratching their heads or saying, come again, what? What? And so Jesus would repeat and repeat. There was a study done probably 20 years ago now. It was a longitudinal study between McKinsey Consulting and a university in Canada. And they studied organizational change initiatives. And after all this money, their conclusion was 2/3 of all organizational change initiatives fail. Wow, you could have sent me the check and I could have told you that. But the deeper work they did is they went back to look at the 1/3 of the organizations whose change initiatives began to stick over time and really influence change and trajectory into the future. And they found one thing consistently in every one of those organizations, and it was a ruthless commitment to being a learning culture. A ruthless commitment to being a learning culture. And then they iterated out 3 significant things that defined what did it mean to be a learning culture. The first one was every leader, every person in the company understood what it meant to take personal responsibility for their own growth and change. Instead of saying what was wrong with everybody else in the organization and how they should change. They took the learning personally. Now that sounds great on paper. Learning sounds wonderful on paper. It's actually quite painful in practice. To be able to sit in a family with a friend, with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, in your work, and to personally own your own strengths and the stewardship of them, and the weaknesses which you prefer to keep hidden or blame somebody else for, and really admit to them, is a pretty profound definition of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. We would mostly rather keep those things hidden. I feel like in my life, God has worked very deeply in some dark areas of my life. And at my age, I'd like to think, boy, I have gotten that area cleaned up so much. And what do you know, but this last year, God's not lifting the garbage can off of one of those again. And I'm saying, no, we've already been here multiple times. It's clean. We don't need to go here again. And he's like, yeah, just put your head over that and take a whiff and tell me if we're done. And I'm like, yes, that's why we leave the lid on. I used to have a magnet on my refrigerator at home that said, I didn't say you were wrong. I said I was going to blame you. Just how do I get that off myself? And there is a humility and there is an authenticity that becomes uncommonly open to negative feedback. Christians ought to be the least easily offended people in the world. But that's clearly not the case right now. It's like walking on eggshells around us because we have our litmus paper out and there's so many different kinds of people that can't get in. And that's not where Jesus started his ministry. Jesus started his ministry on the margins and said, yoo-hoo, all you in the center, this is where the kingdom of God is, over here. How do you be a lifelong learner? First thing is you take personal responsibility when you get feedback that's difficult. The ministry that I mentioned to you in Chicago that was for the post-college and college-age kids, I had a very young staff, loved working with them. Had one guy in particular, Steve, who was my associate. And it took a long time to build trust with him. About a year and a half into our working relationship, we had a pretty good rhythm going on together. So he came into my office one day, he looked a little nervous, he sat down, he said, can I talk to you? I said, of course, I have an open door, I'm such a good leader, you can come in and talk to me about anything you want. And then he started it off by saying, I just need you to know I'm not the only one that feels this way. Yeah. So really don't do that either. But first, don't date your best friend's girlfriend or boyfriend, but don't do that either. So I sat there and I thought, okay, this is not going to be either praise or just a question that I can help him with. And he said, these are his exact words, "Your meetings suck." I'm like, is there anything in that Oreo cookie approach where he's trying to compliment me? No. Now, on the outside, I smiled. On the inside, I was thinking, dude, you still have amniotic fluid behind your ears. Do you even know what I do all day long? I am working so hard for you. But I said, tell me more. That's just fascinating. And then he went on to say, when you first got here, for the first 18 months, your meetings were unbelievable. They were the talk of the whole organization. They were creative and inspiring, and they caused collaboration, and we came up with these great ideas. And now, I don't know what you're paying attention to, but you've put that on the plate of somebody else, and it's just excruciating, and especially when we compare what they used to be and what they are. I mean, I went home mad, embarrassed, and everything in between. And then I feel like at night when I put my head on the pillow, wondering if I'd ever fall asleep, I feel like the Holy Spirit said, and what part of what he said to you is not true? You have dropped the ball. People will walk through fire for a vulnerable leader. And vulnerability only is possible if you are growing in your life with a true confidence you're God's child. That's where it comes from. So the next day I went in, thanked Steve, addressed the whole issue at the next staff meeting, to which you could tell everybody was looking at their shoes, like, I can't believe you told them we said this. And we talked it through. And we talked about how important it is for them to be able to give me that kind of feedback, because I want our meetings to be spectacular. I want them to be, if they were given a choice between a movie and a meeting, and I'm not kidding, I would want them to pick the meeting. And Steve, read Death by Meetings. Steve was the only one brave enough to tell me that. So the first thing to be a leader is you've got to be able to own your own growth. The second thing is there are no topics off limits. I had one CEO that bought a bunch of Beanie Baby elephants for each VP on his team and said there will be no elephants in this organization. Elephants are hard to clean up after if you don't know where they are. And so if you know where they are, if you say as a team, as a leader, that there is nothing that we can't discuss, then we can fix the problems that need to be fixing. And, you just have to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to understand how many times Jesus used difficult conversations and conflict to spiritually form people. Do you know he used those more than prayer and encouragement put together? And yet our spiritual formation sometimes can just so lean to saying chirpy, kind, nice things instead of really what the definition of love is to will the good for another person. And the good is that there are elephants that we need to talk about. Doesn't mean you'll get the outcome you want, doesn't mean that they will change necessarily, but it does mean that you've opened the door for conversation. And then the third thing is you begin to solve problems at a systems level, not just put a Band-Aid on things. People who follow Christ have the confidence to say if there's a problem in a relationship, in a family, in a company, at school, we can together dig deep and get to the root of the issue and try to solve it from that problem. That's another thing Jesus was doing all the time. Many of his conversations would start off on a pretty superficial level, and then they would drop deeper and deeper and deeper, because he knew that if he just solved it up here, it would be behavioral modification. If he dug deep, it would be spiritual transformation. And then the second thing that you need to lean away from, this is out of John chapter 21. I'm going to give you the word in a minute. So you need to lean into being a lifelong learner. And one of the things that we sang earlier is that I'm gracefully broken. It's a lovely song. Brokenness isn't usually a graceful process. And so to be able to be open to whatever it is that God has to do in your life over time to show you the areas where you aren't trusting him, not in a way to just simply drive obedience, but in a way to drive you to understand that the universe operates on this kind of love that you can believe in. That's what shifts our behavior to an obedience. In John chapter 21, Jesus has a pretty strong reaction to this particular sin that I'm going to talk about that we need to lean away from, that really gets in the way of us being able to turn the world upside down. This is the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. And it's fascinating. It starts off in the chapter that the disciples are back fishing again. You need to read between the lines and understand what John is trying to tell you here. Their discouragement was so great that their belief that they were going to be part of something that turned the world upside down had dissipated rapidly, and their discouragement had sent them out to their previous occupation. We will just go back to doing what we knew. It's over. Not only is it over, we feel foolish because we believed in it, and they're out fishing. And they notice that on the shore, there's somebody bent over a fire, and he calls out to them, "Have you caught any fish?" And they say no, and this man on the beach says to throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will catch some. And they did, and they did. And then Peter, you gotta love, the bumbling disciple, puts two and two together and thinks, oh my gosh, this is Jesus. He takes his outer garment off and he jumps into the water. This time he does not walk on the water, and he swims to shore to get to Jesus first. And then I love this because John, the disciple, is writing this. So this is what Peter does, and then it says, the other disciples followed in the boat, like the way you were supposed to. Very orderly, very unorderly. And then it got up very quickly to find that Jesus was bent over this fire, making bread and fish for their breakfast. And this is just an aside for no extra charge, but men, when you want to ask yourself over the course of your life, what would Jesus do? Cook. I'm not making it up. I'm just the messenger right here. And it's not just grilling because there's bread involved, okay? Free of charge. Free of charge. You want to turn the world upside down? Share in household responsibilities so that your wife can actually also be part of turning the world upside down. Okay. Back. I just have 6 minutes and 10 seconds, and I don't like speakers that don't end on time. So then Jesus takes this opportunity to walk with Peter down the beach, and it says that the disciple John followed behind. And I don't have time to go into it right now, but there's a Greek framework for the questions that Jesus asked Peter 3 times. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. It's the exact same structure that is used the 3 times that Peter denies Jesus. And so using that same framework, Jesus is reinstating and forgiving Peter by following that pattern. And it says, finally, he asks them again, and Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. So Jesus, directly face to face, is giving Peter his call. Ever think, well, God, if you would just tell me what I'm supposed to do with my life, I would do it. Maybe you would. It's not what Peter did. So Jesus says, you're going to feed my sheep. You're going to be the great shepherd. I'm giving the keys of the kingdom to you. And then, while he had Peter's attention, he just threw in this bonus of what was going to happen in Peter's future. And in addition to feeding my sheep, I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted, but when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And one more time, he said, follow me. Be the chief shepherd of my people as I ascend back into heaven. And here's how you're going to die. It's not going to be pretty. And Peter, because he got that revelation directly from Jesus, said, okay, sign me up. For sure, that's great. Oh. Peter committed the sin of comparison. He turned around and he looked at John and he said, what about him? What about him? I heard what's behind door number 1. Let me hear what's behind door number 2, and I'll tell you if you have a deal or not. Let me compare them. Now, I'm going to read you Jesus' response, and I got to tell you, there is no way you can hear these words without understanding that Jesus' tone was more vitriolic here than it was when when the woman was caught in adultery. Make of that what you will. Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. The acid corrosive effect of comparison will keep you from being who God wants you to be because he wired you different than anybody else in this room and in the world. And you need to follow that call. It won't always be clear. It will often be painful. It will sometimes be full of great joy. But your job is to refuse to allow comparison to make you feel superior or inferior to anybody else. When you drop comparison, you will learn painfully and then joyfully over time to be genuinely happy for somebody who receives some blessing from God that you wish was yours. You will find that God wired you for a reason and loves you that way because he made you that way. And you will be tempted to compare yourself consciously and unconsciously hundreds of times a day, and this will become one of your primary journeys in spiritual formation with Jesus. What is that to you? You follow me. What the world needs to be turned upside down are people who stand on platforms and give speeches, and people who, as mechanics, hold their open, greasy hands out to God and say, you have filled me so deeply, I've got to give back, and the only way I know to give back is to be who you made me to be. In 1 Samuel 17, Saul, I think very well intentionally and cowardly, allows David to go out and fight Goliath because nobody in his army wants to, and he puts his armor on David. And a little bit like the Disney movie, The Sword and the Stone, you get the picture of David walking around for a minute, tottering, barely able to stand up, and finally, with great courage, but maybe more than courage, just a great knowing who God made him to be, a shepherd. He takes off Saul's armor, and he goes back to what he knows, the slingshot and the 5 smooth stones, because that is who God made him to be. And God's power gets released in us when we are trying to be who God made us to be, not looking at who God made somebody else to be. And out of jealousy or inferiority, wanting to be that person. Like learning, that sounds good on paper, but it's painful in practice until you get good at it, and then it's wonderful and it's freeing. The world needs people at home and people in the marketplace. It needs people at the DMV and the post office and Starbucks. It needs school teachers. It needs middle management. It needs doctors and lawyers. It needs mechanics. It needs everybody living out their life with a template of who God made them to be, humble to be, open and lifelong learners to understand how God is shaping them and driving their soul back to the core identity that underneath all of this is that you are a beloved child of God, and so is every single human being you will ever lay eyes on. And that is an unstoppable force that will change the world. Let's pray.